Welcome to Redundancy Matters. I'm June Hogan, and this is the podcast where I help HR professionals and leaders managing redundancies to put people at the heart of the process. In today's episode, I'm joined by Clare Chappell, an employment lawyer with over 25 years' experience. And Clare specialises in supporting women facing redundancy during pregnancy and maternity leave. And she also advises employers in these situations. So she's really well placed to share her experience on both sides. This is a sensitive and complex area of employment law, and how you handle it is what makes all the difference to the individual and the process. So we talk about what does the law actually say, where do employers go wrong, and what does a fair and thoughtful process look like. It's a really practical conversation about the rights, the risks, and the responsibilities to handle this in the right way. I really hope you enjoy it, so let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to today's episode of Redundancy Matters, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Clare Chappell, who is an independent employment lawyer, and we're going to be talking about all things maternity and redundancy. So welcome to the show, Clare.
Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Wonderful. And really excited to dig into this one because I know it's an area that can be quite complicated. It's an area that's quite emotive, and it's also an area that you have deep expertise in. So, really excited to hear more. So would you just like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, my name's Clare. I'm an independent employment lawyer with Carbon Law Partners. I've been doing this for 25 and a half years now. I guide employers and employees through tricky employment law situations to help them get to a better place for themselves or their business, whatever that looks like for them in their particular situation. So I quite like working with both employers and employees, not at the same time, obviously. It gives me the perspective from both sides of the fence, as it were. So I think I can offer more value to either party because I'm kind of thinking also about what would I do if I was acting for the other party in the particular situation. So I quite like that variety. But I do a lot of work with women who are on maternity or are pregnant and have been treated poorly for reasons that seem connected to that pregnancy and maternity situation. So from the employer's perspective, I approach a situation where there's a woman on maternity leave or pregnancy, so redundancy, which is what we're going to talk about. I always try and approach that from a perspective of kindness, of wanting to be nice to somebody, even in a difficult commercial situation. I was reflecting on how to sort of summarise where I come at these situations from the employer's perspective, and came up with this. A commercial decision to reduce headcount may be necessary, but the decision to be clinical or cold about it is a choice. You're not just making a role redundant, you're interrupting a person's life at its most vulnerable and transformative stage. How you handle this will be the only thing she remembers about your company for the next 20 years. I might come back to that when we come to the end of our discussion, but It's a useful little summary about the things that HR should be reflecting on and thinking about, and maybe aiming for when they're making those difficult decisions, and including women on maternity leave in their redundancy exercises. And as we talk, hopefully listeners can reflect back on that thought and see how it feeds into the kind of things that we're discussing.
Mm-hmm. And there's some really powerful words in those reflections, and not least for anyone who's experiencing redundancy, it's an emotional time, it's a financial shock, it's an emotional shock, an interruption, as you say there, to the career, to the whole lives, really. It touches lots of different elements. And women on maternity leave have got that whole other dimension that they're dealing with as well, which naturally will be affecting their emotions and how they respond and react. So when you think about, you mentioned there that you work on both sides of the table. What are some of the pitfalls that you've noticed in supporting women on maternity leave who are at risk of redundancy?
When supporting individuals, it's a hugely vulnerable, confusing, exhausting, hormonally driven time. And they're facing loads of changes, and not just if it's the first child, Each time there is a difference, each baby's different. How much sleep they're getting might be different. And work can be the constant in the background, even when they're off on maternity leave. They have the idea of work being there, that they're going back to it. They have that kind of plan in their head. The variable, if you like, is the maternity leave, is their experience of being off on mat leave and what is going on for them in those 20-minute periods of time that you break your day down into when you've got a tiny baby. And if the work situation goes wrong, turns wobbly, gets confusing, that is even more discombobulating than it is if you are sitting at your desk when it happens. You're away from work. You don't know what's going on day to day. You're not seeing those people going in and out of meetings. You're not necessarily invited to all of the meetings. You're not privy to all those discussions by the coffee machine. You don't know what you don't know. And having that rug pulled out from under you when you're at work is confusing and stressful enough. But when you're away from work and in a completely different gear, because you have a massive gear shift when you're on maternity leave, you're just not in work. You're quite rightly concentrating 100% on your baby. And it's a very difficult change to flip back into, if not impossible, to go back into that work mode and then feel like, for want of a better way of putting it, that you feel like you need to defend your position and maybe try and avoid being made redundant. What's going to happen? All the uncertainty. And it's very difficult to deal with at that vulnerable time. So that's really the main sort of concerns from the employee's perspective. And from an employer's perspective, it's about thinking about that, being aware of that, and how can we ameliorate the impact on the woman on maternity leave if she has to be involved in a restructuring. That's where I sort of try and approach it from.
And interesting reflections. It was some time ago now since I was put at risk of redundancy on maternity leave, but I can really resonate with what you said there about not being in the groove, not being in work mode, because you've checked out of that when you went on maternity leave. And it does make you feel even more vulnerable, as you say, because you're having to flip your mind back into work. And those sorts of discussions and those sorts of meetings, they require, your full attention. And it can can make you feel even more vulnerable. So I think there's some really interesting reflections there. And certainly I resonate with a lot of what you said. So the law has changed. And as you say, not everybody who is on maternity leave can be put at risk of redundancy. Do you just want to give us a quick overview of the legislation?
The basic summary of it is you can still make a woman on maternity leave redundant. It doesn't prevent that. All it did was extend the period that she's protected for, which broadly speaking runs from the point that she's pregnant until around about 18 months after the birth. And broadly speaking, the protection is just that if her position is redundant, then she's entitled to be offered any suitable alternative employment that might be there elsewhere in the business. If it's suitable, doing air quotes that our listeners can't see, obviously, is something that you need to look at in each situation. I mean, you can get her job spec and a job spec of an alternative role, match them up, and if they're pretty close, it's probably going to be suitable. But that's really the basic thing, is she's entitled to be offered suitable alternative employment, not just given the chance to apply for it, not just interviewed for it, offered it. The only time when a competitive process might be okay is if there are 2 or more women on maternity leave who that role might be suitable for. And so they are in an equal position, if you like. That's the only time at which there should be any competitiveness over that suitable alternative role. Otherwise, she is straight in there. And that's a rare example of positive discrimination that does advantage women on maternity leave if there is that suitable role for them. You don't have to create a suitable role as the business. There may well not be one. There often isn't. But if there is one, then she's entitled to be put into it. That's the main change from that legislation. So just to backtrack from that point, it's really important to have gone through that process and organising your reorganisation before you actually crack on and do it. Things like, what does the current structure look like? What does the new structure look like? Who's involved? Are there any women on maternity leave involved? Put a big highlight around their name, because you know that as HR planning the reorganisation, you need to pay attention to where they are now, where they're going to be post-reorg. Think about the business rationale for the reorganisation, for any redundancies that result from it. Get that really tight, because any employee solicitor is going to question that business rationale. And I've seen some very fluffy rationales that are gobbledygook, frankly, that nobody really understands what they mean. You could run them through AI and AI still wouldn't know what they're actually getting at. So please be very clear about the business rationale, because that is going to be looked at down the line if there are any questions over who's done what. Yes, there are additional risks with making women on maternity leave redundant, but it's not impossible. It's just another hurdle to jump through, and to make sure that you've lined things up to be prepared for pushback, to be prepared for questions. But being transparent probably gets you quite a long way in these situations, I think. If you are kind, if you go through a process which is kind, that doesn't throw surprises into the mix, that communicates well, that bears in mind that there are people out on maternity leave, that therefore adjusts the process to take account of that, pay them as a kit day for coming in for a meeting, and make sure that they do get paid, that they don't have to chase you for the payment down the line. This is all about giving them a positive memory, if not a happy memory, because it's still a redundancy, right? Give them a positive memory of the experience, and that is going to change their view of how they're being treated, I would suggest.
And that, when you talk there about kind of going back to the planning stages and understanding, who's likely to be impacted. You mentioned before, in terms of the 18 months of protection, you might have someone who's returned to work. So, making sure that your systems are up to date and you've got that ahead of time. And when you mentioned there about kindness and that ability to start the process with that intention, as opposed to an email firing in or hearing about it on a WhatsApp group from a colleague because nobody thought to let you know because, you're not checking your work email anymore, or that kind of thing. That really helps to set things off in as positive way as possible, even if the outcome might not be that that woman is retained within the business because there isn't anything suitable that she can do.
Yeah. I mean, none of this about the process is to say that she automatically will remain with the business after the reorganisation. As I said before, business needs are what they are, and it is not impossible to make somebody redundant while they're on maternity leave. That's not what the rules are. There's another thought that I had about at the outset of the process, where it's out of sight, out of mind, right? And so when you're looking at that org chart at the beginning and putting that big highlighted circle around the woman's name who's on maternity leave, HR should then be ensuring that the manager doesn't take the view that, oh, well, because she's on mat leave and somebody else is doing her job at the moment, that means that we don't need her going forward. And therefore just get rid of that bias that potentially is there in the manager's mind, that because she's not there at the moment, it's easier to remove her role from the org chart as part of this process. I think that's something that often gets missed, and it's about managers making sure that they are not just merrily trampling ahead with their biases intact and not thinking about how things work in normal times when everybody is physically doing their job. So that's another point to make. The other thing from a manager's perspective, and as I said, therefore from HR's perspective, is the thought that we should do it now while she's off, because then she can make a fresh start after her maternity leave. I would say that assumption is just as damaging to the woman, because that then jumps straight to, yes, you are definitely redundant, is in the manager's mind, and therefore she's removed from that org chart. And definitely sends her through that experience of dealing with a redundancy while she's on maternity leave. Is there an alternative timing, perhaps? Even if we think that probably her role is going to get removed, if it's just her role, can we maybe at most say, this is a possibility, but we're not going to progress it until after you're back from maternity leave, so that we can properly review your role as it stands then in 6 or 8 months' time, or whenever she's back? Should it be postponed? Can we be thinking about perhaps offering a non-standard settlement deal in that scenario? Obviously, her SMP, her statutory maternity pay, still has to be paid. But is there something that we can extend out of what we, quote, normally offer on redundancies to take account of the fact that she's not going to be ready to look for another job until, let's assume, the end of her maternity period? There are things that can be done to soften the blow, in my view. And that those are a couple of examples. But I think that the idea of suddenly being told, by the way, you're at risk of redundancy, without that soft landing, whatever that looks like for the business, that really exacerbates the difficulties that she'll have in changing gear from being on maternity leave to suddenly having to front up to some fairly serious conversations at work.
Absolutely. And what you said there about having a look at what flexibility there could be, certainly when we support women on maternity leave without placement, I can pretty much guarantee that they will all say, I'm not ready now. Can I get in touch with you towards the end of what would have been the end of my mat leave? And of course we're super flexible because, that's what we're all about as a business. Because that wasn't part of the plan. Their 2-month-old, 3-month-old, 5-month-old baby, they were planning to spend the next X number of months with them. And not least of all, the fact that they wouldn't be in a place to go for interviews and kind of do all of that heavy work.
Absolutely. They won't have childcare in place.
No.
They might still be breastfeeding more regularly than they would certainly after babies at 6 or 8 months old.
Yeah.
There's all of these things that go into the melting pot of what this experience is like for the woman on maternity leave. And yeah, I mean, the outplacement point, a lot of the time we'll see in settlement agreements that outplacement support has to be started within 3 months of the termination date. Well, that doesn't necessarily work when you're on maternity leave. Do we want to change the termination date to push it back so that therefore then buys those 3 months that way? Or do you, as a business, want to terminate because it's your end of year and you want them off the payroll? And then do you give them a longer period within which to start outplacement? I mean, I'm not saying which one of those is the right answer. It'll always be different depending on the business. But those sort of things should go through the thought process.
Yeah, absolutely. Otherwise, either as an employer, you're just paying for service that the individual's not going to be engaging with, not going to be getting the most out of. And from an individual's perspective, I think, well, that outplacement was hopeless because I wasn't in a place to really engage with it, but I felt like I had to. And it's another example, as you said at the start, of leaving those lasting impressions of, did they really care about me? Yes, they had to make difficult decisions, but was this just transactional or was it actually person-centered?
Yes. Yeah. Is it about me or is it just about I'm a number on a page in a spreadsheet?
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about some of the kind of, I guess, the myths that you think employers have around women on maternity leave. You mentioned there about, oh, well, it'll be easier for her if we do it while she's on maternity leave. And certainly my experience in HR and having, worked with stakeholders, this notion of, oh, well, they're planning to go on maternity leave, so they probably won't be interested in, some of the alternative roles, and making these assumptions and having that filter. Are there any other myths that you come across when you're working with employers?
Well, there's that, and there's the broad myth of, well, we can't make her redundant because she's on maternity leave, when you actually can, as we've talked about. The myths, I think, are really around things that when you're working or when you don't have children, and without wishing to sound patronising in any sense, because that's not where I'm coming from at all, but when you're at work or haven't had maternity leave yourself, it's very difficult to imagine what it's like. Even when you have had kids, 1, 2, however many, if you've had more than one, you'll know that they're all different. And your experience of having a baby, the birth of the first weeks of the feeding and the sleeping and everything, your experience is going to be different to somebody else's. And I think that fact is really important for HR and for managers to remember, and for HR to ensure that managers understand. Because from that comes, as the business, we don't know how she is. We don't know what kind of birth she had. We don't know what kind of follow-up care she needed, what kind of care the baby might have needed. How's feeding? How's sleeping? Hers and the baby's. Therefore, how engaged is she going to feel physically able to be in this process? We don't know any of that. And because she's on maternity leave, it's very difficult to demand answers to those kind of questions. How are you feeling? Are you going to be fit enough for us to run you through a redundancy process? I'm not sure that's a very attractive question for HR to run. I don't know how you'd feel about picking up the phone to somebody on maternity leave as HR and ask those questions.
No, it wouldn't be a comfortable one. And it leads me to thinking about that notion of when women go on maternity leave, how do they want to keep in touch? Not the keep in touch days necessarily, but how do they want to manage that communication? And if you haven't got a plan or agreement, then as you quite rightly say, it can feel awkward to get in touch because you just don't know any of those things.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Because you as the business, you can't insist that you send a weekly email. She may have asked for updates on anything major, but then actually change her mind once she's on mat leave and doesn't want to hear anything or doesn't open any emails, and you don't know if she's opened them necessarily. And there's all of the main thing that you know is that you don't know what's going on for her right now. And so it's hard to say, well, what she said about communication preferences before she went on mat leave might not apply now. And so from that perspective, it's quite difficult to therefore anticipate how anything is going to land. Generally, I think I'd probably suggest comms from her manager, a friendly WhatsApp, can we have a quick chat and a catch up, to then transparently communicate what the situation is, rather than an email from HR saying we need to have a catch up about a reorganization that we're planning. Can you do this time?
Yeah.
And it's things like giving her alternative times and places and methods. Ask her if she prefer a Teams or a phone call or a face-to-face in a cafe near where she lives. What's going to work best for her at this stage? And that might change as maternity leave goes on and routine changes and confidence grows and all of those things.
Certainly, from my perspective, to just come in, have the meeting and leave again. You don't want to come in and everyone ask you, how's the baby? How are you doing? And all of that. I remember walking through an open plan office and I hadn't been in since I'd gone on maternity leave. It was awful. And if they'd have just said, well, where would you like us to meet? A cafe nearby. All of these things, now that you're talking about them, I'm thinking these small details, that would have really made a difference. And I'm sure make a difference to a lot of women who find themselves in that situation. They feel like someone, as you say, is being kind and thoughtful and not just looking down the list going, right, well, we need to see Sheila at 10 o'clock on Monday. So just book her in,
Yeah. Because that might not work with childcare. And, so if you ask her and you take a kind of baby first line with it and say, if you need to go and comfort the baby because they're crying, or if you need to feed them because they've woken up a bit earlier than you were expecting them to, that's all fine. We'll pause. We'll come back to it. I mean, many people might say, do you know what, I'll carry on and, you can't see on camera and we'll just get on with it because I'd rather get the meeting done. But that should be her decision. And the employer shouldn't sort of push either way, I think, for me. But no, I completely can empathise with that, being told to come into the office in the middle of maternity leave and not really being quite sure what the outcome was going to be and having to switch gear. I mean, adrenaline must be the rescuer, I think, at that stage, which is, healthy or not, depending on your point of view about it, I suppose. Gets you through it, for one thing. But yes, thoroughly unpleasant. And, and I speak as an employment lawyer. that was my day job, and luckily I was able to get my game face on and get on with it. But yes, it was not fun at all. And and as I say, that's me speaking as an employment lawyer. This is what you do. You can do this. And I was able to have that conversation with myself quickly, and it was all fine. But that's me as an employment lawyer. That's not somebody who doesn't do what I do. As a job.
Could be their first experience of redundancy, like you said, their first baby, or even their second or their third, and all of these things are all variable. And are there any themes from the women that you support that you would draw on in terms of when employers get it really wrong? And is there anything there that keeps coming up kind of time and time again? I know you've given us some advice on what employers should be doing to support women in these situations. And as you said, they can make women redundant. It's not to say you can't. But does anything come up for you as a recurring theme when women come to you for support?
Oh, the lack of communication and the way that things are communicated. So yeah, absolutely. That is a major, major cause of upset. A lack of flexibility and understanding in terms of availability for meetings and where to meet and when, and how long is the meeting going to go on for? Sticking to timeframes that you've given. If you've booked a meeting for 11 o'clock and she's basically got until about 11:45 before baby's going to start waking up from their nap, then you have the meeting at 11 o'clock. Maybe you have a buffer time between meetings in that scenario so that you make sure that you can hit her meeting slot that she has set with you because that fits into the current routine. It's that consideration, communication. But communication for me goes all the way back to before somebody even becomes pregnant. It's the policies. It's the how do we treat people who go off and have babies? How do we treat people when they come back from maternity leave and return to their job? How do we treat people who want to work more flexibly now they've got a baby? How do we treat people when they return from maternity leave? Do we provide them with returners coaching? Are we a little bit more understanding about them needing time off whilst baby settles into nursery and catches every germ going? It's all of that piece that is the atmosphere and the culture that's created in somebody's mind before they even get pregnant. Then they're pregnant, then they're off on maternity leave, then this is happening. Their experience of this, of the redundancy and the restructure, is all part and parcel and is informed by that culture that's been instilled in them from the business from way back when. And they come at this with all of that experience, positive or negative. And I think that is what then feeds into the responses and the reactions to communication or lack of flexibility and understanding over arranging meetings, expectations about just switching gear into defending your job from baby signing classes. That's quite a tangent. And it's that understanding and that communication and the empathy and, an understanding that they don't know what they don't know about where she is right now and how to go about getting that information for them to then run through the process they need to run through, including deciding when they need to run through that process with her. That's the real trick in all of this. And I don't have any sort of magic solutions for how HR have those conversations. That's the sort of, I can talk to the principles and then the, how do we deal with the impact of how you've done all of this stuff.
And I love what you said there in terms of the holistic approach to all of this and how that woman feels when she's on maternity leave, whether she's at risk of redundancy or not. And therefore, if something like this does happen, because, you can be on maternity leave for 12 months, in some situations, if that's what you choose, a lot can change in 12 months.
Absolutely.
And so still feeling part of the team, of the organisation, still feeling valued in whatever way that works for her, is hugely important. So that if this kind of thing does happen, then, as you say, it's not been 9 months since anyone spoke to her or had any kind of contact. But what I've really enjoyed from our conversation is the way that you've talked about not having those assumptions and not having that judgment and not looking through your particular lens about what it means to be on maternity leave, whether you're a father or a mother or neither. This is about this individual and being curious about them and how they're feeling in this situation. I think that's hugely important, because then it all goes back to, right, so now we know this, how can we make this process fit around her, as opposed to making her fit around our process because we've got 4 weeks to do this in, and we need to have 3 meetings and it needs to all happen by the end of March.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, from a financial cash flow perspective, from the business's perspective, you're going to have to pay any remaining SMP, notice pay, statutory redundancy, holiday pay. If you're going to offer settlement agreements, you're going to offer some compensation on top of that. Is there an argument, and this is a question for the employer, is there an argument that you should pause the reorganisation as it affects this individual and come back to it after she's back from maternity leave? Because you've got those costs anyway.
Mm.
If you wait until after she's come back, as you've said yourself, in a period of a year, if not less, things can change. Is it better to park her redundancy depending on the circumstances, and if her role is being removed or if she's been selected in her absence from a group of X number of employees, whichever? Is there an argument to keep her there, keep it all on pause, deal with it after she's back? She's still protected for, say, 6 months after she's back if she's had a year, give or take. And deal with it then. When you know she's back, you know what flexible working arrangement perhaps she's asked for. Because let's say, and I've seen this happen, let's say you have a reduced requirement for somebody to do what she does. She's working 5 days prior to maternity leave, you only need somebody for 3. Actually, she turns out to have been intending to ask for a flexible working arrangement of 3 days a week. That means she can carry on doing the job on the new 3 days a week, no redundancy payout, you've still got that employee. And guess what? She thinks you're brilliant and you've bought more loyalty by waiting, seeing what flexible working arrangement she wanted, because you knew she was going to ask for one in the scenario I'm talking about. And you've been able to find something that works for everybody. That's a win for her and that's a win for the business.
Mm. Yeah. And what you described there around retaining talent, which, as you mentioned earlier, often women returning from maternity leave can find that, the environment is different when they come back, even those that are coming back to roles at which they left, and having that support in place. But that ability to retain the talent that otherwise would have been lost in that redundancy process, if circumstances allow, as you say, there's lots of variables there. And so in that sense, would you approach that in terms of putting her particular process on hold, or depending on the relationship that you had with her, would you be open and transparent about those conversations, I guess, depending on where she is in her maternity leave and all these other variables?
It would depend. Sorry, that's a lawyer's answer. It would depend on the relationship with her. It depends on what that culture is that's already been sort of created and built up around her and across the business. It would depend on where she is in her maternity leave. It would depend on the type of redundancy that we're talking about. Is it that she has a unique role and it's that role that's being removed, in which case it's a standalone issue? Is she part of a team that's being cut from 10 to 6 and she's one of the 4? I mean, that's a scenario where it's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, I might say, well, wait, because you're scoring her while she's not around, which is, you're relying on memory from 6 or 8 months ago from when she was last in the business. Is that going to be safely objective? Do we have any biases we need to be mindful of there? Plus, then you've got 6 roles still there, and they're probably going to be suitable alternative employment, so therefore she should be plugged into them. So it's risky not to plug her into one of those roles. There's a lot going on in either of those redundancy scenarios. That's why I say it depends, because it's really hard to generalise. It's better to say it depends, and there's enough, and there's always going to be enough issues there to warrant HR taking a very close look at it and probably getting legal advice to look at what's the best way to play this. And of course, as I said before, the best time to do that is before you actually start having those consultation meetings, at the point of planning, working out your business rationale and your before and after organisation charts. Yeah. That's the point at which to work all of this out, not be suddenly floundering middle of the process when somebody says, hang on a minute, I'm on maternity leave and you're supposed to give me one of those alternative roles.
Yeah.
That's the point at which I get the panicked phone call saying help.
And I guess in an ideal scenario, I'm thinking about the support that you provide for individuals who might be listening to this, the people listening to this who are on maternity leave themselves, or more likely HR professionals and leaders listening to this. What would you advise in terms of how you can support and how best to support a process in this way, from assuming we're at the start now, we haven't even kind of started things?
Well, that was going to be my main point, was speak to me before you've jumped off the cliff and committed to anything publicly in terms of the plan, the reorganisation, who's at risk, what you're going to do. And let's have a look at it and check for risk. I mean, it's not just women on maternity leave. It might be people with disabilities who say you've got a return to office mandate and there's a real going around that. But if you've got a disabled individual, you need to think about reasonable adjustments for them in terms of perhaps they continue to work from home, and you've got a whole policy sort of scenario to deal with there. So getting advice before you jump off a cliff is always a good idea. That would be the main thing. And from there, everything else follows, because then we talk about the scenario, we look at the process, we look at where your risks are. Are you prepared to manage those risks, reduce those risks? Are you prepared to take those risks, and go from there? And so anyone who's listening, how can they get in contact with you? How can they find out more about how you could support people in this situation? Okay, well, they can find me on the Carbon Law Partners website, which is carbonlawpartners.com. I'm also on LinkedIn quite a lot, so you can find me on there. I don't have an I in my name, just for people listening. Probably help find me. Clare and Chappell have various possibilities, don't they? And the way that I work, just to sort of start things off, is I will always have an exploratory chat, sort of 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever is needed, to find out more about the situation, talk about how I can help and what the next steps are from there to get a client onboarded and then actually be able to start work for them. So I guess the next step is get in touch with me via the website or via LinkedIn, and we'll arrange a time for a chat, and then we can take things from there. Wonderful. Well, I'll put all the links in the show notes so people can access those quite easily. And Clare, I've really enjoyed our conversation today, just really getting into some of that detail. And it's taken me back a few years to when I was on the other side of all of this. And a lot of what you said has really resonated in that. And it's clear from your experience that you've got a really deep understanding and connection with this area in particular. Well, clearly, you're an employment lawyer, but this is something that I can tell and hear that you've got a real passion for as well. So thank you for sharing all of that with us. Oh, that's really kind of you. Thank you. No, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed chatting to you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Redundancy Matters podcast. I hope you found today's episode helpful. It would mean a lot to me if you would follow, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, as this helps it reach more people who are managing redundancies. Let me know what you thought, and if you have ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn, June Hogan, and get in touch via my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk, where you'll also find more resources to help you manage redundancies. I hope you'll join me again soon for the next episode of Redundancy Matters.